Of the texts of Plato, which shaped all of Western philosophy, only 7 ancient copies exist today. Of Homer's Iliad, the most celebrated work of Greece, about 600 manuscripts remain. Of the 4 Gospels, written by fishermen, a tax collector, and a physician, more than 5,800 copies in ancient Greek have reached us. More than 19,000 in other languages. No document of antiquity comes close to these numbers. And most impressively, these texts survived the greatest efforts of destruction the ancient world has ever seen. To understand the magnitude of this preservation, you must go back to the beginning. Not to the moment the Gospels were written, but to the world in which they were born. A world without the printing press, without cheap paper, without any form of mass reproduction. Every copy of every text had to be made by hand, letter by letter, line by line. A single Gospel could take weeks to copy. All 4 together represented months of uninterrupted work. The material used was papyrus, made from a plant that grew on the banks of the Nile. Expensive, fragile, sensitive to humidity. A papyrus roll, large enough to contain the Gospel of Luke, cost the equivalent of several days' wages for an ordinary worker. And papyrus degraded. In humid climates, it rotted within a few decades. Even in ideal conditions, it rarely lasted more than 100 or 150 years before needing to be copied again onto another material. This was the first enemy of the sacred texts: time. But there were others. The first Christians had no temples. They had no official structures. They had no legal protection of any kind. They were a marginal sect within Judaism, viewed with suspicion by traditional Jews and with contempt by the Romans. Their meetings took place in private homes, at discrete times, often at night or in the early morning. And it was in these gatherings that the texts were read. Think of the logistics of this. A Christian community in Ephesus at the end of the 1st century obtains a copy of the Gospel of John. This copy likely came from another community, perhaps from Antioch, perhaps from Alexandria. Someone had to copy the entire text by hand. Someone had to transport this scroll for hundreds of miles, crossing roads guarded by bandits and controlled by Roman authorities. And when the scroll arrived, it was treated as a treasure, guarded with care, read aloud to groups who could not afford to own their own copies. Most early Christians never held a gospel in their hands. They listened. They memorized passages. They passed on what they remembered. And the communities that possessed manuscripts knew the responsibility they carried. Then came the first wave of organized persecution. Nero, in the year 64, needed someone to blame for the Great Fire of Rome. He found in the Christians a perfect target. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded what happened. Christians were covered with the skins of beasts and torn to pieces by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were turned into human torches to light the imperial gardens at night. In this context of terror, keeping a Christian text was signing one's own death warrant. But the copies continued to be made. During the next 250 years, the Roman Empire launched at least 10 major persecutions against the Christians. Each emperor had his methods. Domitian demanded that everyone swear loyalty to him as a god, and those who refused were executed. Trajan established that confessed Christians should be killed, although they were not to be actively hunted. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, allowed mobs to lynch Christians in various provinces. Decius required all citizens of the empire to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate proving it. Anyone who did not present the document could be imprisoned, tortured, or killed. And in each of these waves of violence, the manuscripts were targets. Roman authorities understood something fundamental. Destroying the texts was more efficient than killing the faithful. You could execute a Christian, but others would arise. You could destroy the text that sustained their faith, and perhaps the message would die with it. It was with this logic that Diocletian launched, in the year 303, the most systematic attempt to eradicate Christianity from history. The first edict ordered the destruction of all churches and the burning of all sacred books. The second ordered the imprisonment of all clergy. The third required prisoners to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or be tortured to death. The fourth extended the requirement of sacrifice to all Christians in the empire. Soldiers went from city to city. They entered houses, they searched hiding places. Any manuscript found was confiscated and burned in the public square. In some regions, bishops handed over the texts to save their communities. They were called traditores, those who handed over. The term gave rise to the word traitor in English. The stigma lasted for generations, but others hid the manuscripts. They buried scrolls in gardens. They hid codices inside walls. They dismembered texts and distributed the parts among different families so that the destruction of one hiding place would not mean total loss. Some Christians memorized entire books, becoming living libraries that no search could confiscate. Diocletian's persecution lasted 8 years in the eastern provinces of the empire. 8 years of searches, arrests, executions, and systematic destruction. No one knows how many manuscripts were lost during this period. No one knows how many versions, how many copies, how many texts disappeared in the imperial bonfires. What we do know is that it was not enough. When Constantine took power, and in the year 313 issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians, the texts resurfaced. They came out of hiding. They were copied with renewed urgency. And something remarkable happened. The copies that emerged from different corners of the empire, separated by thousands of miles and decades of isolation, were extraordinarily consistent with each other. This was no accident. It was method. The scribes who copied the sacred texts followed rigorous protocols that had roots in the Jewish tradition of preserving the scriptures. Every line was counted, every word was checked. A discovered error meant that the entire section had to be redone. There was no room for approximations or paraphrases. Fidelity to the original text was treated as a sacred obligation. The Jews had developed this system over centuries to preserve the Torah and the prophets. Christian scribes adapted the method for the Gospels. In some communities, a reader dictated while the copyist wrote, and a third person verified every word immediately. In others, the copyist worked alone, but another scribe reviewed the completed work, comparing it line by line with the original. Errors still happened. It is impossible to copy thousands of words by hand without making slips. A letter swapped here, a word repeated there, a line skipped when 2 consecutive sentences ended similarly. Modern scholars have catalogued thousands of these variations among existing manuscripts, but the vast majority of these differences are trivial. Spelling errors that do not affect the meaning, inversions in word order that do not change the sense, synonyms replaced by other synonyms. When experts analyze the text of the Gospels we have today, they estimate that more than 99% of the content is identical to what circulated in second-century communities. No document of antiquity has undergone such intense scrutiny, and none has emerged so well from the process. Part of the resilience comes from the very nature of Christian expansion. The faith did not spread in a centralized way, with a headquarters controlling the distribution of texts. It multiplied organically, community by community, city by city, each making its own copies and sending them to others. When one region suffered persecution, other regions were in relative peace, preserving their manuscripts. When a copy was destroyed in Syria, dozens of others existed in Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and North Africa. It was like trying to put out a forest fire by blowing on the flames. Every breath spreads more sparks. In the 4th century, with persecution officially ended, a new phase of preservation began. The Emperor Constantine commissioned 50 complete copies of the Bible for the churches of Constantinople. These were luxurious codices, written on high-quality parchment, designed to last for centuries. 2 of these manuscripts, or at least fragments of them, have likely survived to this day, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, both dating from the mid-4th century. The Codex Sinaiticus was discovered in 1844 at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. A German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf found monks using sheets of ancient parchment to light fires. When he examined the material that was about to turn to ash, he realized they were pages from one of the oldest Bibles in the world. It took years of negotiation to gain access to the complete manuscript. Today, parts of it are divided between the British Library, the Leipzig University Library, the National Library of Russia, and St. Catherine's Monastery itself. The Codex Vaticanus has been in the Vatican Library since at least 1475, when it appeared in the first catalogue of the collection. No one knows exactly how it got there. For centuries, the Church severely limited scholars' access to the document. It was only in the 19th century that a more complete examination was permitted. What researchers found was extraordinary. A manuscript nearly 1,500 years old that contained practically the entire Greek Bible, with the 4 Gospels in a remarkable state of preservation. But these great codices tell only part of the story. The true resilience of the Gospels lies in the thousands of smaller fragments, in the partial copies, in the pieces of papyrus found in ancient trash heaps, in the passages quoted by writers of the early centuries. The oldest known fragment of the New Testament is a piece of papyrus about the size of a credit card, catalogued as P52. It contains only a few lines from the Gospel of John, chapter 18. It was found in Egypt and is today in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Paleographers have dated the writing to approximately the year 125. This means that a copy of the Gospel of John was already circulating in Egypt, thousands of miles from where it was written, possibly only 30 to 40 years after the original composition, 30 to 40 years. The generation that knew the Apostle John was still alive when this fragment was copied. There are today 140 catalogued papyri containing parts of the New Testament. More than 300 parchment manuscripts written only in capital letters, the ancient style called uncial. Nearly 3,000 manuscripts in lowercase letters, a style that developed from the 9th century onward. More than 2,400 lectionaries, which are liturgical books containing passages organized for reading in churches throughout the year. Added to this are the citations from the Church Fathers. Writers such as Irenaeus of Lyons, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Augustine, and dozens of others quoted the Gospels extensively in their works. Scholars have calculated that if all the manuscripts of the New Testament were destroyed today, it would be possible to reconstruct practically the entire text just from these patristic citations. The Gospels did not survive by chance. They survived because thousands of people, over 2 millennia, decided it was worth risking everything to preserve them. Consider the work of a copyist monk in the Middle Ages. He wakes up before dawn. He says the first prayers of the day. Then he goes to the scriptorium, the monastery's copying room, where he will spend the next 8 to 10 hours hunched over a table, writing by candlelight or light from small windows. In winter, his hands go numb with cold because fires were forbidden near the precious manuscripts. In summer, sweat drips onto the parchment and must be constantly blotted. Some manuscripts preserve notes from the copyists in the margins. They are human records in the midst of sacred work. One monk wrote, "Thank God it will soon be dark." Another recorded, "The ink is bad, the parchment is rough, the day is dark." A third left this vent, "He who does not know how to write thinks this is no work. 3 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body suffers." These men dedicated their entire lives to the task of copying. Some lost their sight after decades of meticulous work under dim light. Others developed spinal deformities from being hunched over for so long. But they continued. They copied the Gospels 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times over the centuries. And it was not just monks. In the Eastern tradition, monasteries in Syria, Armenia, Georgia, and Ethiopia developed their own traditions of copying and preservation. The Gospel was translated into Syriac as early as the 2nd century, into Coptic in the 3rd, into Gothic in the 4th, into Armenian and Georgian in the 5th, and into Slavonic in the 9th. Each translation required new generations of copyists, new communities dedicated to preservation. The Latin version, known as the Vulgate, was produced by Jerome in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Jerome spent decades working on the translation, consulting Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, living in a cave in Bethlehem to have enough silence for the task. His translation became the standard text of Western Christianity for more than 1,000 years. Thousands of copies were made in monasteries from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to Germany. Irish monasteries deserve special mention. During the centuries of chaos that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, when barbarian invasions destroyed libraries across continental Europe, the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland remained islands of preservation. Monks like Columba of Iona copied manuscripts with obsessive dedication. Legend says that Columba personally copied more than 300 books during his life. Truth or exaggeration, the fact is that Celtic monasteries preserved texts that would have otherwise disappeared. Later, Irish missionaries returned to the continent. Columbanus, Gall, Boniface, and others founded monasteries in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. Each monastery became a new center for copying. Each center produced manuscripts that were sent elsewhere. The network expanded constantly. In the Islamic world, the Coptic Christians of Egypt and the Syriac Christians of the Middle East continued copying and preserving their texts even under Muslim rule. There were restrictions and occasional persecutions, but the communities survived. Their manuscripts survived. Some of the oldest New Testament papyri were found in the storehouses of Coptic monasteries in Egypt, preserved by the dry desert climate. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century transformed everything. The first printed book was a Bible. Suddenly, it was possible to produce hundreds of identical copies in weeks, instead of spending years making a single copy by hand. The risk of total loss, which had haunted the texts for 14 centuries, practically disappeared. Once the Gospels were printed and distributed throughout Europe, no persecution, no fire, no disaster could ever destroy them completely. But the story did not end there. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began to discover unexpected treasures. In Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, excavators found an ancient trash dump from the Roman era. Amidst business contracts, personal letters, and tax receipts were fragments of papyrus containing passages from the Gospels and other early Christian texts. The dry climate of Egypt had preserved for nearly 2,000 years what European humidity would have destroyed in a few decades. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea, trying to find a lost goat. He heard the sound of breaking pottery. Inside the cave, he found jars containing ancient parchment scrolls. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Although most of the texts are from the Old Testament and Jewish writings, the discovery revolutionized the understanding of the world in which the Gospels were born. Other discoveries continue to happen. In 2012, scholars announced the identification of a fragment of the Gospel of Mark that may date to the 1st century. The debate over its dating continues, but the possibility of having a piece of papyrus touched by someone who lived while the apostles were still preaching is extraordinary. And then there are the manuscripts that have not yet been found. Scholars estimate that thousands of ancient texts still lie in uncatalogued monastery libraries, in unexamined private collections, in caves and ruins yet to be excavated. St. Catherine's Monastery, where the Codex Sinaiticus was discovered, recently revealed palimpsests with previously unknown texts. Palimpsests are parchments that were scraped and reused, but where the original writing can still be recovered with modern technology. What does all this mean? It means that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John passed through a survival test that no other document of antiquity faced. They were actively persecuted by empires. They were targets of systematic destruction. They existed for centuries in fragile forms, depending entirely on human copyists for their continuity. And they did not just survive. They reached us in a quantity and quality that leaves all other ancient texts in the shadow. There is an irony that runs through this entire story. Every time an emperor ordered the manuscripts burned, the communities scattered and took copies to even more distant places. Every persecution forced Christians to multiply the texts with even greater urgency. The fire that was meant to consume the message ended up spreading the embers. Diocletian died. His decree turned to dust, but the words he tried to erase were read on the day of his funeral and continue to be read 2,000 years later in more than 3,000 different languages. The Gospels did not survive despite the persecutions. They survived, in a way, because of them, as if there were an invisible hand turning every attempt at destruction into an instrument of multiplication. The prophet Isaiah wrote that the word of the Lord stands forever. The history of the preservation of the Gospels is not just confirmation of that promise. It is the concrete demonstration that some things simply cannot be erased, no matter how many empires try.